Mein Name ist Daniel Opp, ich leite das Mysterious Lab in der Zeit-Stiftung. Gemeinsam mit meiner Kollegin Miriam Büttner haben wir diese Session heute vorbereitet in der Aftermath of the US-Election. Und damit bin ich auch schon bei dem Punkt. Wir werden diese Session heute vor allen Dingen in Englisch ausnahmsweise durchführen, weil wir ein internationales Podium zu diesem Thema haben. Lassen Sie sich davon nicht abschrecken. Wir werden, oder unserer tollen Moderatorin Geraldine de Bastion, die gleich auch noch ausführlich vorgestellt wird und hier schon einmal winkt. Wir werden versuchen, dass wir Sie trotz auch des Anspruchs des Themas auf jeden Fall runterzubrechen, dass auch wenn es um Fachbegriffe geht, alles allgemein verständlich bleibt und wird und auch für Sie nachvollziehbar ist. Und ganz wichtig, wenn Sie im zweiten Teil mitdiskutieren möchten, können Sie Ihre Fragen auch auf Deutsch natürlich stellen. Wir werden sie dann aktiv mit einbinden und übersetzen. Und mit diesen Vorworten für diese hoffentlich sicher spannende Stunde gebe ich jetzt an Miriam Büttner, die ganz maßgeblich dieses Thema heute bei uns im Mysterious Lab mit vorbereitet hat und ein paar einführende Wörter sagt, bevor es dann auf die virtuelle Bühne geht. Ich wünsche uns eine ganz spannende, tolle Stunde. Danke.
Thank you, Daniel. I will switch right into English so that everybody understands what I'm saying. At the Bucerius Lab of the Zeit Stiftung, we deal with the major issues of digital transformation. One of them is the handling of data in a digitized world and what rights we as a civil society have in this. In our session today, we will talk about the consequences of the US presidential election for American and European digital policy. What does the new President Joe Biden think about regulation? How will he deal with the trade war with China involving companies like Huawei and TikTok? What does this mean for the EU? How do we defend our values with regard to data protection? Do we need more digital sovereignty? With all these questions, I would now like to introduce you to our moderator, Geraldine de Bastion. She is the co-founder of Connective, advising organizations on digital transformation. Her work focuses on international cooperation, innovation, and human rights. She's been part of the curatorial team for the Republika conference and regularly organizes events in the field of politics and digitization. We're happy to have you here today, Geraldine. And I now give the virtual floor to you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I have to say, I do miss the Werte House in Hamburg. And I am, though, very happy to be part of this digital lunch session and to see you all. So, ladies and gentlemen, Miriam has already introduced you to the topic of today's discussion. I'm sure a lot of us shared the same sentiment at the weekend. I woke up on Sunday, and from the beginning of the speech of Kamala Harris to the end, I was in tears of joy to see this kind of symbolical politics take place instead of the symbolism of the last 4 years. And I was the first to say, oh, let's not start taking things apart on the first day. Let's just have a moment to enjoy and rejoice. But now we do want to start taking things apart and preparing ourselves for this next administration to come. And as Miriam said, Joe Biden is likely to take the White House in January, with the question whether there will be a majority of seats of the Senate, and a very divided country, especially in the face of the current corona pandemic. We don't know that much yet what this administration has planned in terms of digital politics, but we can expect a continuation of the alliances between Silicon Valley and US company strategies and this White House as well. So as Miriam also already pointed out, in light of this global power play between the US and China, what can and should Europe be doing to protect its digital sovereignty and equip itself for an AI-driven future? I am looking forward to discussing this question with our panelists, but also together with you. Please do feel free to ask questions and comment. We'll be bringing your comments and questions live later, but you can also use the chat to whisper something to me if you'd like to. So I would now like to introduce our panelists to you, and perhaps they can give a little wave as I call up their names. Dr. Heinrich Wething is the head of the political department of Die Zeit. Before that, he worked as an editor for FAZ. Amongst other positions, he was also a correspondent in the US, I believe, in San Francisco.
Absolutely
And
right,
he's
yeah.
also, good. So with some bilateral comparisons to be looking forward to from his side later on. He's also one of the co-authors of the Digital Charter, and back when we were still able to travel, was touring around the US, sharing the insights of that charter also with an audience there. So welcome to this discussion, Heinrich.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
I would also like to welcome Julia Reda. She heads the Control Project at the Society for Civil Rights. And from 2014 to 2019, Julia was a member of the European Parliament, doing really groundbreaking and incredibly important work on net political issues, especially around the EU copyright reform and regulation of online platforms. Julia is also a Shuttleworth Fellow and board member of the Open Knowledge Foundation Germany. It's really great to have you here today, Julia. I'd also like to introduce to you Gerd Hoppe. He's been a member of the Beckhoff Automation Management Team since 2003. Prior to that, he set up their North American branch as the CEO and general manager there, and is currently involved as a representative and founding member of the Gaia X initiative, which he's going to be sharing more insights around later. Thanks for joining us today. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Chris Wormann, who has been working with and for civil society since 1999 and joined in different positions, really. TechSoup quite some time ago. Since 2011, he's been holding leading roles with TechSoup's program design and communications group. For those of you who don't know, TechSoup is a nonprofit that works internationally with a network of non-governmental organizations and provides technical supports and tools to these nonprofits. So it's great to have you here as well, Chris. Thank you for joining. Okay, so as I said in the beginning, we don't know that much about the digital policies we'll be expecting from this administration. But on Tuesday, President-elect Joe Biden announced a roster of policy experts that are going to help him ensure a smooth transfer of power. We'll see if that's actually on the cards or not. And enable the new administration, as he said himself, to hit the ground running. So this is a very extensive list of about 500 members that have been called this board. But a lot of technology companies are really well represented in this. It includes employees from Airbnb, Amazon, Dell, Dropbox, LinkedIn, Lyft, and Uber. It also includes employees of the philanthropic organizations of the big tech moguls, so the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Schmidt Ventures from Google's CEO Eric Schmidt. And one, here's some good news, it includes one representative from a technology-focused nonprofit group, which is Jean Kimmelman of the Public Knowledge Foundation, who's to be part of the transition team for the Department of Justice. So there's a bit of hope there. Given Kamala Harris's track record, we really, and also her personal affiliations, one might say, are not very likely to find an ally in her when it comes to internet privacy, algorithmic data gathering, net neutrality, and so forth. I follow Penny Red, Laurie Penny on Twitter. I think all of you should if you don't already. And she said something very clever before the election, which is that you vote to choose your enemy, your opponent, not your friend. The one that you want to be working against, the one that you respect more. And I'd like to sort of pass this quote on to you, Julia, with a question of, do you think this is true in case of the Biden-Harris administration? Where are your expectations, but perhaps also your fears when it comes to digital policy from this new administration coming up?
Yes, thank you, Geraldine. I very much agree with that quote. On the one hand, of course, the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is to be celebrated. It's got the potential of moving the US out of a gridlock if the Democrats actually manage to prevail in the runoff elections for the Senate. Because for a very long time, I remember last year when I was at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, there was a kind of resignation about the federal government's ability to pass any sort of legislation on digital issues or other issues as well. So for a very long time, if there have been any innovations around digital policy coming out of the US, they have come from the state level or even from the local level. So for example, the Californian Privacy Act, which is quite closely modeled on the General Data Protection Regulation, although offering a much lower standard of data protection. Or, for example, also some of the local bans on facial recognition technology in the public space, which is something that we do not even have in Europe at the moment. So if the Democrats actually manage to prevail in the Senate, they might, for the first time in a very long time, be able to pass federal legislation at all that can sort of move things forward. But at the same time, I'm not very optimistic that this legislation is necessarily going to be protective of fundamental rights on the internet, especially in the field that is close to my heart, copyright reform and intellectual property more broadly. Both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are known more as hardliners, very much prioritizing the interests of intellectual property holders over the public interest, which is also going to be a very important question in the upcoming conflicts we are likely to see around the distribution of coronavirus vaccines, where the question of patent rights and the extent of patent rights is going to be an important question. But I also want to be optimistic. I think in some areas that are not so much about legislation, but about the distribution of funding, for example, to privacy supporting technologies, the Trump administration has been extremely harmful. So, for example, Donald Trump had replaced the leader of the US Agency for Global Media with somebody close to his political agenda, which led to the defunding of the Open Technology Fund, which is a very important fund for open source software that protects journalists, fundamental rights activists worldwide. And I think this kind of shows that even if this is going to change now with a new administration, that Europe should not make itself dependent upon these very important projects being supported by the United States, which kind of brings us back to this question of digital sovereignty.
Absolutely. I want to take that point you raised, which I think is a very important one to look out for, and pass it on to Chris, because for a long time, the funding provided through the OTF was one of the few possibilities for NGOs to get any kind of funding in this topic area. And the dismantling of that has been a great concern to many activists around the world. Since you are working with many yourself, do you share this hope that we can see this being put back on the agenda and reinstalled? And what are your also maybe shared concerns with Julia about some of the other net political digital rights topics regarding this administration?
Sure. Well, thank you all for the invitation. And I very much agree with Julia's points. I think that, one of the things that clearly the administration did negatively was dismantling the Open Tech Fund, or at least challenging its capacity to do good work in the world. There were legal battles over exactly the assault on Open Tech Fund and how far that went. So there's a little breathing room. I do think Open Tech Fund will be back. Interestingly, you did see several other parts of the US foreign aid community, USAID, State Department, ramp up their investments in looking at international development specific to internet freedom and governance. It's hard to say last administration, I guess it's still the administration. And to your point earlier, Geraldine, I kind of hope they'll leave gracefully at some point. The point being, they there were new funds made available to look at digital rights abroad. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. You know, I think the positive side is that USAID has started investing in digital rights and digital policy work abroad for the first time. They've established fairly significant funding for that. But I would encourage people who are interested in the topic to read the USAID digital agenda. I had the, I would say pleasure, but I'm not sure it was really a pleasure, of being one of the people who helped put it together. And there are some fairly overt political projections within that about sort of American values for digital abroad, which, you know, depending on the administration, I may or may not be so comfortable with those values and what that means. That said, there is work with the Internet Freedom Community, again, funded by USAID, to build networks of digital rights activists abroad and help them come to better collective intelligence on what sorts of policies might be built locally, how to advocate for those policies. This is not talking about Europe. We're talking about Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. So again, pros and cons, I think you'll see that continue. I think you'll see a lot more investment in domestic internet questions, especially around ending the digital divide. There are quite a few policy proposals working their way into the Biden incoming administration around that. The big tech antitrust suits, I don't think they're going to stop. I do think that, you know, I don't necessarily have a lot of hope for the US suddenly becoming enlightened in this regard. We could get into why, but I think, you know, if you follow the news, the points you made at the beginning, Geraldine, about who's associated with who, again, I'm skeptical about how far and how fast the US goes. I do think there are some positive things, again, around domestic and connectivity issues, international and rights that can be worked with. But I very much appreciate Julia's point that I don't think anybody should be relying on the US to be some sort of enlightened leader in this space. We need our own agendas. We need them to be based on our values, and we need to support them.
Right. And whether we should be looking for more enlightened leaders or sort of a more grassroots democratic approach to things is perhaps something that we can get to in the course of this conversation. I want to pass what you said on to Heinrich with this question of, do you agree this sort of America First sentiment to be something that's going to stick around? I mean, Joe Biden has promised to return to multilateralism, but nobody's really sure what that could mean in the digital space, because we're not really likely to see these trade wars that were already mentioned subside in terms of a different approach to the sort of new regionalism we're heading for, or would you see a path out of that?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying I don't want to deflate the balloon here, but I think the digital policy is not very high on the agenda of the incoming Biden administration. We have to be clear about that, I think. Every incoming administration has to decide upfront where to invest their political capital, which is limited for every administration. And this is especially true, I think, for this administration coming in a time of multiple crises. So they have made it very clear what their top priorities are. Battling the coronavirus, of course, rebuilding infrastructure, jumpstart the economy, and tackle social and racial injustice and the climate change. And then after all that is done, which we will not see in 4 years, down the list, there is digital policies. Both Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have been rather silent on the campaign trail about these topics. There are a few interesting points they made. We will discuss them later, certainly. You, Geraldine, have already mentioned that Kamala Harris cultivated rather cozy, schmoozy relations with the Silicon Valley since her time as prosecutor in San Francisco. She was on the book tour for the book by help me out here. The number 2 at Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg's book, and Sheryl Sandberg's book was promoted by Kamala Harris, so they helped out vice versa when a couple of months ago the heads of this and the CEOs of the big tech companies were testifying before Congress. Kamala Harris was not very hard hitting on them, so I don't expect very tough regulations or a dramatic change from that. There's one point though I would like to make which I found interesting, and maybe there's a perspective in the long run. Joe Biden had an interview with the editorial board of the New York Times, and he said, first of all, he said that he would like to revoke Section 230, which reduces liability for the platforms to close to zero for user-hosted content. That would be a huge step. I don't think necessarily it will happen. But then he said we have to model our privacy laws and we have to look for the European example there. So he specifically referred to European legislation for privacy. And that I find very interesting and even encouraging. We will have to wait and see how this goes out when it comes to really policy making there.
Absolutely. So I would like to pass it on to Gerd Hoppe to see, from a private sector perspective, are you in agreement with everything that your fellow panelists said, or are there different expectations when it comes to doing future business with and for the US from a German or European company perspective?
Yeah, it's hard to say. So it's a yes and no. I think if we all would agree to each other, then it's getting boring for the audience. So I'm trying to give you a little bit of insight from a practical point of view. It's a lot of politics and expectations. I think that Biden still has to establish his position in American politics. He's cornered in by the question about the Senate as an assisting system to him or as an opposing system to him. Trump has placed hundreds of people into administrative agencies and roles. 50% of the voters of the American public have voted for Trump. And so as much as we have to say that, as with every respected country, we will work with a leader of choice, the question whether Biden can truly, except from tone and appearance, change direction in policies has to be waited for. From a business point of view, the overall overarching theme is not really connected to Trump or to Biden, but is more connected to the question whether Europe can continue to rest comfortably in the role of a geographic area in the world which is strongly leaning on the leading role of Silicon Valley and the American role in the internet and digitalization world. We can look at China. China has chosen to go its own path. If we set aside the view about human rights, we can truly say that China is no longer dependent on American products, technologies, or infrastructure if it comes to digitalization. Europe is still strongly dependent on offerings from American suppliers. The fact that we're meeting on Zoom tells a story in itself. And then we have to accept the Zoom terms and conditions to be able to meet here. It gives me a smile. Of course, I knew this before, but it highlights the point. In fact, we're seeing two things now we're seeing that digitalization is taking, since a long time, an important role in our private lives. And if we choose to not participate, to not carry a smartphone, to only carry a cell phone of the old style, then we are basically cutting ourselves out of many domains of our private life for choice. This is something that we have embraced in our inner understanding of what digitalization is, whereas in the industry, I'm coming from the manufacturing domain, the idea that the customer is the product, the mantra of the Silicon Valley market companions is not very accepted. So the idea of America proposing to Europe that the industry would have to convert to a services-oriented industry was never picked up in a broad sense for good. Because if we as a society want to be independent, then it is very necessary to maintain the entire set of value chain components to create a value chain inside Europe. To give you an example, energy consuming industries like mining or producing of aluminum or other metals seems to be weird inside Europe. But the corona pandemic shows us literally that basically every necessary medication that we need in our daily lives and in hospitals is coming from China. So if China chooses to not deliver, then we don't have antibiotics. If China chooses not to deliver seldom earth materials, we cannot produce electric motors, which we need for cars and for our industry. And we had these shortages because the single source of these materials is China. If we look at semiconductor, America is dependent from semiconductor makers in Taiwan and China. The design is in America, the making is in China. Is this a path to follow? I personally do not believe in that. I think that what we understand as the complete value chain inside the region is the right path to go. And the strong position of Germany is a premier example why this strategy is a careful and balanced one, because we have, unlike most other countries, we have the ability of these value chains inside Europe. So from this broader picture, looking at digitalization, we have to find a position in our own values and becoming an adult in this topic.
Thank you, Herr Hoppe. You've already sort of moved into the next section that
Sorry
I want. No, you did very well transitioning from the one into the next, because we do want to now head toward a European perspective on the topic that we're debating today. I just wanted to pop in a question that came in from our audience meanwhile, before we move to the more European perspective of things, which is a question about the division of power. So seeing how, depending on how the next months turn out, how much power will US President-elect Biden actually have, depending on the majorities in the Congress or the Senate? This is more of a general question of division of power. Chris, do you maybe want to answer that one quickly before we move on?
I wish that US Congress would truly exercise more power in these areas. I think that the potential is there, the balance of powers, et cetera. Unfortunately, we've seen under the last 3 administrations an enormous consolidation of power under the executive branch and the issuing of executive doctrine. So writing out executive pronouncements as if they were law. And that is something Biden is promising to do as soon as he gets into office, start issuing a lot of executive orders to revoke things coming out of the current administration. So I think it's unfortunately consolidated towards the executive. I would wish that the Biden administration might de-escalate that a little bit and start returning some power to Congress. Unfortunately, it's sort of an old political axiom. People who take power rarely give it away. So we'll see. I think Julia's point earlier about local governance issues is a very important one. I moved back to Europe about 3 months ago. I'd been in the Bay Area for 6 years before that, and Eastern Europe for 10 years before that. And the Bay Area and some of California's work around California Privacy Act, looking at some of the facial recognition bans, looking at the ways in which some other states have gotten very progressive around deregulating connectivity issues to allow for alternative models. I think there's a lot of hope in the federal nature of the United States to create promising models from the bottom up that can influence national policy. To Heinrich's point earlier, I think it's a long, slow game to wait. And, Geraldine, as you put it, to wait for some sort of savior from the top. The incentives aren't there. And not only are the incentives not there, I personally don't know that that's even the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. We're talking about redefining social contracts and governance models in a digital era. If that doesn't bring people along to understand why they should care, instead of waiting for them to be sort of anointed, then I think we're going to miss a lot of the opportunity to recreate in a way that's actually more understood and useful, create the political will behind the laws.
So thank you very much, Chris. I want to use that as a stepping stone. And like I said, Gerd Hopper also helped us on the transition there to now turn to the question, what does digital sovereignty mean from a European perspective? So maybe Julia, you can chime in there, especially if we want to see digital sovereignty not as something that's given to us sort of from above in a more authoritarian context, but as a grassroots and democratic process. What does it mean to you?
Yes, I sometimes get a little bit nervous when digital sovereignty gets presented as a sort of us versus them mentality. I don't think it's a good idea for us to say, okay, we need to have a European Facebook and a European Google, and that is necessarily the way forward. But rather than, insisting on everything being made in Germany or being made in Europe, we should really invest in open solutions, open hardware and open software that anyone can use and that we have some level of control and transparency with. One really big problem, or let's say the central problem of the US-EU data transfers and the Schrems rulings by the European Court of Justice is the fact that American companies are required under US law to hand data over to the NSA, the US Secret Services. So in order for us to have any sort of certainty that our data flows are not going to secret services or indeed to criminals, to all kinds of actors that we might be uncomfortable with, is to actually know that there are no backdoors in the software that we're using. And I very much also second Gerd Hopper's point about the hardware side of things, that Europe doesn't really have the capacity to build its own computers from the ground up. But well, at the moment, the travel of direction in the EU on these issues around transparency and encryption is rather going in the opposite direction, where we see that the Council is working on a resolution kind of thinking aloud about backdoors in encryption in messenger services. The European Commission has already announced a legislative proposal that would require the operators of messenger services to filter out child abuse material from encrypted communications, which is not possible if you actually want to have end-to-end encryption. So I'm very worried that we are currently doing exactly the opposite of what we should be doing, which is to invest in open solutions that prioritize IT security and resilience, so that if one government somewhere else decides not to fund this kind of technology anymore, that the technology doesn't disappear or ends up not being maintained or improved anymore.
Yeah, I share these concerns. I also have a concern that we are heading toward a very increasingly geopolitical and still very sort of physically limited perspective on how internet models can work. So just because we have this geographical distribution between the US and China, why does it have to be a European way per se? I work very internationally, so this is something that kind of bugs me when I look at countries like Taiwan, for instance, who are so ahead of their game and are totally not a part of Europe, but should be an allied partner in this game. Or as Gerd Hopper pointed out, that we have natural resources that we're missing in Europe and are not independent as an entity. So Heinrich, I had the total privilege of having a conversation about this topic with Shoshana Zuboff, the author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, the other day. And she echoed the sentiment saying we should be speaking about democratic alternatives and that we do need to build those from her perspective. So it doesn't need to be a European platform, but a democratic alternative, for instance, to the platforms that we have today. Would you agree with this sentiment? And how do you think about this sort of geopolitical internet models idea?
I agree absolutely with that perspective, but at this point in time in history, I think a democratic solution might very well be a European solution. Europe being the place, I guess, where we have the best chances to develop such a model. And I think we are in the middle of doing just that. You were so kind to mention the travels we had with the Zeit-Stiftung and the group that launched the Digitale Charta, Charta für digitale Grundrechte, Digital Rights Charter. And when we were traveling in San Francisco and the Bay Area and California in general, nearly everybody we were talking about, obviously for different reasons and with a different agenda, hidden or not, agreed on this one point concerning privacy. All eyes are on Europe, and the European models that are being developed by the courts, Julia mentioned, by the European Parliament, by work in Germany and other places, that is kind of the gold standard for the world, for Silicon Valley and the world. And I think we should pick up there. We have a pretty good shot at that. We might not be able to develop a German or a European Facebook or Google or something like that. But we are at the forefront. In fact, we are the avant-garde, I think, in democratization and regulation of the future of the internet. And we should concentrate all our energy in going forward there, I think. And if I may, I just mentioned the work of the Zeit-Stiftung. And I think in a way, although I was participant in that, I think that is a kind of a model. The Zeit-Stiftung a couple of years ago brought together a wide variety of people, politicians, intellectuals, philosophers, what have you, from all sides of the aisle, and in a very stressful, intriguing, fascinating way, they were able to design some fundamental rules that we then introduced to the European Parliament in an effort to give a jump start, in a way, to some kind of human rights charter for the digital age that must be proposed by the European Parliament. There is no other place, I think, that could do it. And there are other examples like that too. So I think grassroots European regulation and democratization, that is the way forward. And we are in a pretty good situation, I think, to go that way in Europe.
I do wonder if that is, without wanting to disagree at all, but if that is the
go ahead, please disagree
perspective. and I would like to ask this question to Chris, because I sometimes wonder whether is this the case, or are we just good at not seeing other processes happening globally in Europe? So I'm thinking about the Web Foundations, the Web We Want initiative, or other sort of more global initiatives to have people formulate what they would like future policies, future frameworks to look like, or whether we actually have this sort of policy-oriented, human rights-based thought leadership in Europe, as was just put.
Yeah, I do think that Europe, thinking about the dominant technology paradigms, policy paradigms between the US, Europe, China, I think they are dominant. And there's something we have to grapple with there. Does that mean that we shouldn't have absolute support for people coming up with their own rights-based, and I would say, human-centric processes? No, of course. I think everybody needs to be working on this. It's not like anybody, I believe, has the answer on how all of this should work out. I think it can be very arrogant, as it has been from a US perspective for many years, to assume that there is an answer and it's the American answer. So I think there needs to be work on a diversity of voices globally on these topics, partially because I work globally. TechSoup works with 1.6 million NGOs across all non-US embargoed countries. Right there, US embargoed, interesting piece of arrogance. But as we do, not everybody's in the same place. To Gerard's point, not everybody has the same resources. 12 to 19% of Africa, depending who you ask, has access to the internet in the first place. So there are many, many different parts of this equation that are different phases of evolution. I do think when it comes to the sort of dominance of the policy paradigms, what Europe has put forward with GDPR and some of the other approaches, some of the other suggestions, has been a rights and values first concept of the internet that Europe wants. Does it need to be the internet for everybody? No, that's not Europe's place to say. Does it need to be the internet for Europe? That's Europe's place to say. And I do think that there is a very strong leadership role that Europe can play there. I agree. I don't know who else is going to play that role, that is trying to guide people to make policy decisions that put some of the higher values of democracy first, not profit first, not control first, but this concept of European values embodied. I think, though, the reality is you're competing with the venture capital funds of Silicon Valley. They are going to build smart, sexy, fast, addictive technology. Pretty good at it, clearly. Is it useful for humanity? Different discussion, but it's gonna be fun. And so this is sort of the place that civil society gets hung up a lot. We're trying to sell social progress and higher ideals, not Coca-Cola to children. That's a hard game. Is there a place for Europe to lead that discussion? Absolutely. And I think going to something that Julia said, this focus on open, and I think focus on models. GDPR gave that example. It was a model that the rest of the world had to abide by to play in Europe. I think that there are many other points in the equation where Europe could do the same thing in a prosumer, speaking of Silicon Valley language I hate, but this consumer first, privacy first internet, the sort of thing that Tim Berners-Lee talks about in his new manifesto. Europe can do that. And I think Europe can regulate that. To Gerard's point, if you want European Union money, you can sort of work down a European value chain to build different models and then look at how those models can bring Silicon Valley along versus instead of this sort of us versus them about it. They want to, sorry.
No, sorry. I'm gonna have to ask you all to keep your answers a bit short, because we have quite a few other questions that we want to get through, and I've received some from the audience. I just want to pass it on to Julia and Gerd also, because they also wanted to comment on what Heinrich just said. So first of all, over to you, Julia.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to Heinrich's optimism about the European Parliament. I mean, I very much agree that the European Union is capable of passing legislation such as the GDPR that Silicon Valley may not like. I mean, we have shown as much, but I am very skeptical that there is going to be a lot of progressive legislation to follow it, because right now, the interests in not regulating the advertising-based business model, which is actually really at the core of the problem, I think, is shared by European technology companies, so internet service providers, telecommunications companies such as Telefonica that are very large players in Europe, and also media companies such as Axel Springer, who also don't want to have this regulation of the digital advertising market. And that, I think, is a very dangerous alliance, because it has pretty much gridlocked the work on the e-privacy regulation, which was supposed to be the legislation to complement and complete the privacy framework with the GDPR. And so also with the GDPR itself, I mean, Max Schrems, as more or less an individual, has been spending close to 10 years in different courts, and we don't know if there isn't going to be a Schrems 4 and a Schrems 5 ruling before this legislation that we all fought for is actually going to be enforced in practice. So yeah, at the moment, I'm not particularly optimistic because, well, large economic interests that are based in Europe and that are not based in Silicon Valley are also standing in the way of progressive internet legislation.
Right, thank you
May I just jump in for one sentence? I didn't mean to say the European Parliament is going to be the place. It should be the place, and it has to be the place in the end. I'm sorry.
No, that's good. Thank you for the clarification. Of course, we share that hope, but as Julia just said, some like dampened expectation management there. Gerd, you also wanted to comment.
Yeah, in the attempt to drive the discussion forward, I think Chris made a lot of very good comments, and I think just describing the American internet business model as advertisement driven is, in my mind, a little bit looking only at one side. As Chris said, on the one hand, we have good models, good roles. I think if there's one place in the world that is considerate about consumer rights and is a very diverse and colorful place of different nations, often so different and so colorful that they cannot get together to speak in one voice, being very slow in decision-making, spending enormous amounts of money on all kinds of topics just to get a little bit of output. There's so much criticism in Europe, despite we have this so diverse and colorful place. Why don't we make a plus out of it? Why don't we see it and look at it positively? And so if there's one place in the world that can take the role of building a better internet, then it is, in fact, Europe. And so the problem that I see is that everyone desires to have that. And then if one comes together to do it, then the criticism is, oh, this will be so slow that the American privately held companies will outcompete us in any way. One can discuss this, sure.
Well, let's get a bit more concrete now, because that is very much the rhetoric that we're facing sometimes. But Gerd, maybe you can, just dig in there for a moment, because when we're talking about digital sovereignty, we can mean a lot of things. And we touched upon things like funding for activist organizations. We touched upon things like dependency on raw materials. But a big topic within this is the topic of data localization and data storage. So something that you're involved in that I mentioned in the beginning is this attempt to rethink that on a European level with the Gaia X project, which is an idea for now, but something that's really due to kick off next year. Can you please give us a very quick overview of what we can expect from Gaia X and the philosophy behind it?
Yeah, so started way before I joined this initiative, I think a year and a half back. It has been driven towards public as a German-French initiative at that time. But in fact, many other nations have declared the desire to join or are already involved. So we have now, I think, 6 or 8 nations in Europe declaring interest in cooperation, above 170 or 200 associations and interest groups or NGOs are involved in this. More than 500 individuals are now working on Gaia X in the one or the other way, driven very much as a user requirements process. The ministries of economy in France and Germany have called for participation in user domain groups from those segments in the society that are listed or under citation in the European Digital Initiative. So something like manufacturing industry, Industry 4.0, healthcare, finance, transport, mobility, so public transport and private mobility, or the individual mobility. Smart living, this would be the smart meters for consumption of energy and other things, or the automatic home. The public sector, so applying for no driver's license, or agriculture, also a big topic in Europe and worldwide. And so these user groups are coming together in domain circles or work packages and have been meeting since about September of last year. So Gaia is truly a Corona initiative because we had 2-3 physical meetings, and since then we meet on video tools. And of course, the infrastructure domain, infrastructure providers, Telecom, Atos, Austrian A1, many other European data centers, data hosters, cloud activities are with us in this group. And the discussion was, do we need a regulation for a European Facebook or data space? And the conclusion is actually that we, as Europe is so diverse, it would not make any sense to start with regulation because we are an open market. Julia has mentioned open as the big topic, and an open society, and we are a free society. So as a consequence of that, Gaia can make an offer to the market. And then it is upon the user's choice. So the user can be Deutsche Bundesbahn or Julia Reich, or Julia Reda, excuse me. So from the private person, not only in Europe, but also the fishing initiative in Peru can choose to host data on a European data center. So what we're doing here is something that is available or accessible worldwide, and it is upon the world or the users from the private and from the public and from the economic sectors to choose whether they want to host their data on Gaia or on Alibaba, and they will make their choices. Yeah? So seeing this, there is no desire to come up with regulation first and something like handcuffs to use Gaia.
I think that's, I find it very encouraging to hear we're offering a solution and something practical instead of just a regulation. Julia, how do you plan to use Gaia X? No, but maybe from your perspective, what are your hopes toward this? And do you think this is the way to go?
Yeah, well, what I really like about it is that it addresses the infrastructure side of things that is often not at the core of the public debate. So for example, everybody is kind of embarrassed about using Zoom all the time, but it wouldn't necessarily be an improvement if we're all using Jitsi, which runs on Amazon Web Services.
Right.
So I think the infrastructure side of things, the backend that is not necessarily visible to users, is also a very important part of the puzzle that should also be open. So that is kind of my hope, that Gaia X is going to help address that part of the issue. I mean, I very much also believe that we need to invest in in the front end part, in usability of open source alternatives, for example. But I think we should also not be making ourselves dependent on proprietary hosting solutions that are available by the likes of Alibaba or Amazon.
Absolutely. So before we run out of time, I do want to open it up for questions from the audience. I have been trying to pick up the ones that came in through the chat so far, but I want to make sure we also pass on the microphone to those who want to speak themselves. So shall we collect a couple and then pass it back to the panel, if that's okay?
Yes, if you would allow me to say one sentence to what Gaia actually will be, because I didn't say that.
Okay.
And then I'll try to keep it very short. So the idea is not to create a system in which there's regulation. These domains, which I mentioned, have their existing standards, and the logon of a computer of the financial sector at the Bundesbank or at another state bank cannot be as in the same way or as open as a computer logging on or a sensor logging on in a simple manufacturing domain. The Gaia X initiative tries to create something that only Europe can create, which is an intermediate layer between the infrastructure providers and the user domains to create their own data spaces. So it's basically only that, with all the policies that we just discussed in the 40 minutes back. So it's not only a technical solution, but also a role model for GDPR, for data sovereignty, for ownership, and offer this to the market. And that'd be enough at this moment.
I would love to continue the discussion at this point, because I would really like your expert opinion on how to differentiate between something like Gaia X or India Stack, for instance, which I understand has a lot of the same ideas and sentiments. Yeah. But I will pass it on to Daniel because he raised his hand for the first vocal question from the audience. So please, Daniel, go ahead.
I have two questions which are connected, I think, and also important for the audience, which is mainly a civil society and an end user audience, I guess. The first thing refers to digital sovereignty. There was an article in the New York Times in summer, which basically says Europe does need both gold standards and regulations, and all we discussed on democracy models and digital sovereignty in products, which is more than Gaia X or SAP, which are I think all the right ways which you discussed, but it's very much in the back. So my first question is, do you need, for convincing a public in a democracy, visible products? I don't mean we have to recreate Google, Facebook, and so on, but some really visible European alternatives usable for a public and visible so they understand what it means that we are talking about European alternatives. And the second question is, what can be our role as a civil society? For example, as a civil society institution like the Zeit-Stiftung, Heinrich mentioned it, that we started this digital charter process, which was not meant to write European law, but rather to give a push that Europe Parliament should do more than GDPR in broader, wider sense on this topic. So this is a role I can identify very much, but what could we do too, or beyond, to push this topic? These are my two questions.
Would you like to address them to anyone in particular?
Who
wants to? Okay, who'd like to pick them up?
Yes.
Very simple and very short. I think the interested parties should join the process to create content and solutions inside this Gaia process. So just don't stand aside. Do we need European products? I didn't say just moments ago, made in Germany is so us against them. Making products always means collaboration around the world. And of course, all the American infrastructure providers and hyperscalers, they will participate in Gaia and create offerings there. It's the consumer's choice to say, I want my data hosted on Amazon Web Services by Gaia or through Gaia. That will be a choice to make, sure. And so I think one could have European products. I would personally prefer to have a few as an alternative. Can we compete against Google or Facebook? No. We should create other products that are more interesting with more complex role models instead just a flat model of everyone knows everyone and can take everyone's information.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add? Julia and Chris?
Yeah, perhaps just to point out, I agree with Gerd. I don't think it's necessarily the solution to have European products. I think it's more important that we have resilient products that cannot be sabotaged or surveyed by any particular country. But perhaps one piece of potentially upcoming legislation that is interesting in the regard of the network effects that contribute so much to the power concentration in companies like Facebook is that currently the European Commission is preparing its proposal for the Digital Services Act. Mm-hmm. And one part of that is possibly going to include requiring very large online platforms that have significant power over public opinion to allow third-party providers to offer alternatives to the timeline. So because the problem that we see at the moment is that those companies, when deciding what users get to see, they don't necessarily prioritize the interests of the users, but rather the interests of the advertisers. So there is this idea being discussed in the context of the Digital Services Act to open that up to competition so that other companies could offer an alternative to the timeline. I don't really care if they're European companies or not, or even if they are companies at all, could also be NGOs or open source projects. What I think is important is the open factor that allows us to become less dependent on a single company that might also be bound by national laws in the US or China or elsewhere.
Absolutely. And it's really good that you point out the Digital Services Act because it's very much on the way of being made right now. So to Daniel's question, how civil society can get engaged, also a good point of interaction, making sure it's not just big tech companies lobbying the EU on the shaping of this act. Chris, you had a quick comment on this one as well.
Yeah, I think two things. One on the sort of product side, I think there is an enormous opportunity for Europe to be working in the governance and health services space. You know, some of the things that Gaia, some of the different disciplines in Gaia, the less sexy, less consumer product space, you know, people forget how much of our global economy governments are. And there is nowhere near enough investment in GovTech. And what a space for Europe to work on the intersection of technology and values towards the better governance of humanity with tech, instead of not enough investment and the wrong kinds of actors coming in to invest in things like healthcare services and various other government services. So I think thinking about places where Europe might want to really build leadership, build alternatives, and then begin bringing the models and regulations around those to the fore, something like, why compete against Google? Rather build out your models, again, create your own niches and competencies. I think the other thing on the civil society side, Daniel, to that question, we've been thinking a lot about the fact that, you know, more than 1 million NGOs open email from us every week. In Europe, it's about 600,000 NGOs interact with TechSoup. These are small grassroots organizations who do not think about digital rights as their fight, but it is. Digital rights are civil society's fight. It's going to be their fight tomorrow, if it isn't already today, for the very few who've been sort of educated into understanding that or forced to by some sort of malfeasance. I think there's a really important thing to consider about how we increase understanding and awareness about why the kinds of things that you, Julia, et cetera, care about are important to the average bread and butter, mom and pop, after school programs, village care style of civil society, so that we bring political will behind the white papers and arguments. That is a space where I think we can win, versus by creating political pressure from the bottom up, by educating and gaining that, rather than sort of going head to head with very deep pocketed interests who are working against us in Brussels. So again, I think there's work to be done there.
Such an important point that you make, Chris. Thank you very much for that. A point that we didn't quite get to in conversation was that I was speaking to Shoshana about the failed Proposition 22 that California voted on. So should Uber and Lyft have to recognize the drivers as employees of their company? And after the state put forth this law and got through with it, unfortunately, the public decided to vote against it. And Shoshana was saying that this is the point where we need to ask ourselves, why weren't we able to convince the people? Why weren't we able to educate the public so that they would see this as opportunity and not as a threat? So exactly in the sentiment that you were just communicating as well. We have time for maybe one tiny more question. This will be the closing question. So who may I pass the microphone to now?
What is the question?
That is the question. Is there anybody else from the audience who would like to ask a quick question?
Wir haben eine Meldung, Geraldine.
Die sehe ich leider nicht.
Das ist Stefan Vogt von der Open Search Foundation hat sich gemeldet und sein Video schon angeschaltet. Wollen Sie Ihre Frage direkt stellen?
Bitte ganz kurz, weil wir haben noch genau 2 Minuten übrig.
I just only wanted to make a comment, and I wanted to underpin this necessity of an European infrastructure in that we can govern with our own legislation, our own culture, our own ethics. I think that's really important. And like Geraldine, you mentioned that we should also not only think about Europe, but think beyond, think global. But I think it's good to start in Europe first and get our acts together and get a privacy conserving and an infrastructure according to our ideas, and then we can take it abroad and take it further. And I think it's really important, such things like Gaia X, to build these things here first, and then have them open, have them cooperative, be outside. That's just a comment I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It could already be a closing comment, but I do want to give our panelists the opportunity. So maybe we'll close with a very speedy round of like a wish list where you would like Europe headed in terms of digital sovereignty. You can either choose a couple of keywords in terms of technical solutions, the standards that we haven't yet talked about, or a little bit of a nutshell of what you'd like to see Europe doing during the next 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration. Gert, can I ask you to start?
Yeah, I think now is the time to do, instead of just thinking about what one should do. So we are here, politics is always about policies to be amended or to be set up or to be created for future activities to do. But here is the doing. Gaia is coming to life, and of course it resembles a lot of good thoughts created before us. You have mentioned this initiative from India about a common API. I was thinking mostly of X-Roads in Estonia. They have shown that creating their own interconnectivity system gives a boost and a framework of policies to digital sovereignty in Estonia. And I think there's a very centralized system. Estonia is small. We are colorful and diverse, and we are creating the European pendant or the European data space enabler. And so come and join. That's it.
What a wonderful call to action. Thank you so much for that. Chris, may I pass the mic on to you next?
I'm going to pass the mic to someone else. I think I still need to think about the question.
Okay, I'll pick on you last then. That's okay. So Julia, can I ask you to come in next?
Sure. I think a little bit of investment goes a long way. I mean, hopefully, like Chris said, the Open Technology Fund is going to continue in the US, but it's only a very small part of the puzzle. It's mostly focused on sort of surveillance, defeating and censorship evading technology. But what Europe could do to complement that is to start a fund for open source government tech, for infrastructure. Because I mean, when you look at the actual funding that has been going into the Open Technology Fund, it's something like $20 million a year. This is actually more or less peanuts in the German or European budget. So we should just do it. It's not a huge investment, but it could really have a decisive outcome for European and digital sovereignty. And indeed, you know, it could be used by governments everywhere in the world.
Would love to see this happen. Thank you so much for that, Julia. Heinrich, what about you?
Well, just do it is a great way forward, I think. We should try to do it. From a more politics perspective, I would like to pick up one question you asked before about the situation Europe is in between the giants, China and the US. And just a quick thought that it might be in an ironic way be more difficult to find Europe's own place with the Biden-Harris administration because they tend to cultivate the rhetoric of a transatlantic partnership more than Trump did. So you hear that in all policy fields when you're talking to foreign policy experts in Berlin. But that might be tricky to find our own way forward with a more friendly American administration. But we do have to do it on our own way, I think.
An interesting side of thought, not to lose focus in there, even though our enemies are a little bit friendlier than they have been.
They're not our enemies, but they are not our friends either.
I was just picking up on the quotes that I used in the beginning to conversation with, but yeah, absolutely. Chris, now over to you, please.
I would absolutely agree with everybody else. I think the other thing that I would really like to see Europe invest in more is baking in the user design elements in the sort of technology funding that it's going to do. You know, Julia, I'd love to see the European Union do more to fund and create alternative funding mechanisms for open tech, especially in GovTech. It will require learning how to fund differently than the European Union currently does. I think there's some cognitive dissonance I have between how the EU and philanthropy in general have tried to support technology, different discussion. But the mandatory, actual human-centered design element in any funding that comes out of the European Union in the future on both the front end in terms of, are we working with the populations that this technology is intending to serve? Are we taking their interests, rights, and actual user behaviors into our design process on the front end? And then downstream, are we working with civil society on sort of understanding if it's having the intended impact? I don't necessarily need open algorithms, but front end and back end user feedback rather than just sort of a group of people funded to go build things because they're smart. I don't buy that. And I think Europe could bake in some of that to funding in ways that would ensure that products were actually beneficial.
Thank you very much, Chris. I actually think that would make a great future topic for a digital lunch session. So thank you for the inspiration there, and a big thanks to all of our panelists for their really insightful inputs and this session. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, a big thank you to everybody who joined this lunch session and spent their lunch break discussing with us, listening and commenting. I'm very sorry that we overdrew a little bit with time, but I hope you'll agree it was in the interest of this really interesting debate. I also apologize for my over illumination. It's the rare occasion of sun coming out in Berlin in November. So sorry about that. A big thank you from my side to all of you and to Miriam for putting this great conversation together, and to Miriam and Daniel for having me. So I'll pass the word back over to Miriam, also maybe with a little bit of advertising of the next lunch session coming up.
Thank you, Geraldine, first of all, for doing such a great job today, and to all the guests, the speakers on our panel. It was a really interesting discussion, and we would like to get more of it in the future. So maybe we can get back together one day and discuss more. Well, the next session is in planning. We will keep you informed. If you are not on our mailing list yet, you can sign up. I posted the link in the chat. So we will keep you informed about our next lunch session coming up. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Thank you for having
Bye.
us.